Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Museum of Brands. My name is Alina. I am the Community Development Officer here at the museum, which essentially means that I run our well-being program. Before I hand over to our guest speaker tonight, I wanted to take the opportunity to just introduce the museum. And to start with, can I ask for a show of hands? How many of you have been here before? Okay, that's very good. I'm always happy to see not very many hands because it means that it's a new opportunity for a lot of you. So just to let you know, we are the only museum in the world that is completely dedicated to brands and consumer history. And we have the largest collection in the world of brands and packaging, and that means more than 15,000 items from the last 150 years. So if you didn't have a chance to go through the time tunnel, you can do so after the talk, and it's quite an extraordinary thing to go through, so I would highly recommend it. Aside from the time tunnel, we also have a branding hall, which hosts temporary exhibitions. One of them at the moment is Public Health England's guest installation on the century of public health marketing. And this exhibition celebrates the wealth of campaigns delivered to help protect and improve the health and well-being of people in England over the last century. As many of you probably know, powerful communications and effective marketing campaigns are instrumental in delivering government policies and helping to encourage behaviour change. This exhibition is accompanied by a speaker series, which is the reason why all of us are here tonight. And if you want to know more about the series, you can take a look at the What's On flyer, which is on the benches. And do let your colleagues and friends and family know that we are here. These are our hashtags and social media and online presence. We would love for you to talk about us. However, we would ask you to not take a photo and post anything on social media from the presentation today just because of copyrights. You're completely welcome to take photos of our speakers.
It's going to make for a riveting session.
I know it's going to be amazing. It's going to be great. But not of the adverts, if that's okay. We would also like to thank, for our organisation, we would like to thank Public Health England for their support in creating the exhibition and speaker series, and the Marketors Trust, who are supporting our talk series this year. The Museum of Brands is a charity, and money raised from our activities enable this museum. It's quite an extraordinary place to be open, so we're very happy to host this exhibition. Last thing I'm going to say, a couple of housekeeping points. We are not expecting a fire alarm, so if it does go off, please follow me and go outside. It's not a drill. And the toilets are behind you on your right, or left when you go out, because obviously you'll be facing the other way around. And please do ensure that your mobiles are on silent. And now let me hand you over to Peter Graham from Public Health England, who is going to introduce the speaker.
Right, and so very soon actually Joe will get to speak, but so I thought it would be really great just to say a few words about Joe, because obviously I think it's given a good intro. I'm head of commercial partnerships at PHE, and this exhibition that's now here was one of the ideas we came up with as a partner event that we would run a couple of years ago, and it turned into this great big exhibition and series of events, so we're delighted with where it's gone. And I've worked with Jo for many years, when she was working at 23 Red, and actually Jo is one of the brainchilds behind one of our most famous and successful campaigns, Stoptober, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So, you know, she's been instrumental in an incredible amount of work that PHE has delivered, and also extremely award-winning campaigns. So if you've not yet looked at the exhibition, go and have a look at it. It's downstairs. It's, you know, been put together with 100 years worth of love and care and advertising, which seems to keep repeating itself. I think you'll probably touch on that in your presentation as well. So for me, I think actually Jo's one of the most amazing strategic minds I've worked with in the 15 years of government. She's so inspirational, and that's sort of now coming to the fore as Chief Strategy Officer at Mullen Lowe. So Congratulations on that, and also on your new role as the Campaign UK Awards Strategist of the Year. What a gong. So, in short, if anyone can make you do anything that you didn't yet know you wanted to do, it's Jo.
It's like a really sinister opening to a presentation.
Positive behaviour change, though.
Thank you for that, Peter, I think. And yeah, I just want to say that I think the exhibition is absolutely amazing, and I know that you and Helen sort of started it off as being a fairly small thing to celebrate working in partnership, and it became this monstrosity that was absolutely brilliant, and hopefully will be an archive that will live on for the next decade, century. Yeah. Right, so I'm quite interested as to why people are here, because I obviously know some of my colleagues are in the audience, but I know what I'm going to talk about, and it's quite a random assortment of stuff. So who's here because they're interested in health brands? Cool, so there's going to be some of those. Anybody work in health as their career? Cool, okay, and then anybody who's a historian who's going to be able to tell me that I've got loads of the facts wrong? Thanks, Lawrence. I think we were supposed to have about 50 minutes to do the talk, and I'll try and stick to that. I've not done the time rehearsal, which will terrify you to hear. I'm just going to stop at 50 minutes, so we'll see how far we get into it. I think we've got some Q&A at the back end of it. On the point about copyright, I'm really sorry, but we've got about 3,000 images in this, and I tried to get copyright approval on all of them, and you just can't. So just in respect of people not chasing me up on it, it'd be great if we couldn't tweet them. However, because of that, if anybody's really interested in anything that's in the presentation and wants the link to it online, email me and I will send it to you because I've got it. So I feel like that's quite a good deal for you not tweeting pictures. The subject of this whole series is Can Marketing Save Lives? And I'll be frank, when I was asked to do this, my intention was to do a topic about smoking because that's what I've worked on for about 12 years, on smoking cessation. And then a wonderful woman got in on the act before me. It's a girl called Kate Waters, did this talk and did hers on smoking cessation. So the reason that I'm doing the talk on marketing doesn't save lives, marketeers do, is because Kate had already stolen the stuff that I know about. So I've instead, in the spirit of this whole exhibition, went really over the top and have researched what was originally going to be a marketer from every decade in the last century. And I did do the research, but you can't fit them in, so you've got 7, and hopefully you'll be happy with that. And if anyone's intrigued about the other 3 that didn't make the cut, I can tell you about those as well, but just not in the next 50 minutes. So a quick guide to this talk. When I say marketer, that's going to be quite a loose definition. So most of the people that are in this talk would definitely not self-identify as marketers. So it was just a handy way to make the title stack up. So really they're people from any walk of life who had in any way some impact on the work that you're going to see. So hopefully that's fine. And then when I say the work, some of that is in the archive. So you'll have seen it if you've had a look around the exhibition, and we'll reference it as it comes up. But sometimes it's not work, it's a concept, or it's an organisation, or it's an idea, so that's just to excuse that bit. And then when I say marketing technique, I've made those up. So I have kind of overlaid what I think those people were trying to do in modern parlance, so it can draw some parallels with modern marketing. So and I actually think they work, but I thought when we get to the Q&A, you'll have different ideas about what they were doing, and it might be interesting to share that, and I'd be quite up for a discussion on it. So I haven't got all the answers right, is what I'm trying to say. So these are the people we're going to meet, and over the past few weeks that I've been researching this, I've kind of fallen a little bit in love with all of them. I'm going to tell you who my favourite is when we get to that person, but they all have a really interesting legacy in terms of health marketing and have done different things, and some of them were kind of unwilling participants in it, and the first one definitely is one of those people. But they're fairly arbitrary, but I think interesting in their own right, and then some of them are quite problematic, and we'll talk a bit about that as well and why that's the case. But I don't think that means that they should be missed out. So we'll kick off, and as if to illustrate how arbitrary this presentation is, our first marketer is in fact the Methodist minister John Wesley, who was born in 1703. So neither a marketer nor somebody alive in the past century, which I think is a strong start. But the reason I wanted to include him is because we're going to go sort of chronologically through the past century, and the Methodist Church has had quite an impact on everything that's happened within health, and in fact this talk could have been entitled "How Religion Has Managed to Really Fuck Up People's Health in the last century," but I decided not to call it that. But you'll see that there are people throughout who have tried their best through religious motivations to act in what I believe is not in accordance with people's best interests. John Wesley isn't actually one of those. So anybody who knows about the Methodist Church will know, famously advocates temperance. John Wesley himself wasn't abstinent of alcohol. In fact, he drank wine until quite late in his life and then only stopped it because he got gout. He was quite keen on the tipple, was the first person to brew beer with hops. So was actually quite progressive in his thinking. Really interesting guy. Was the first person to venture into an abolition of slavery conversation from a church perspective. So somebody that I think we should be happy to have in this archive. Also, fun fact, the first person to put the phrase "agree to disagree" into the written English, which I think we can all be thankful to him for. Even though this is John Wesley's part of the story, I think that there are two Georges who are perhaps more important. And the first one is David Lloyd George. So obviously our wartime Prime Minister between 1916 and 1922. I think he's quite an interesting character because he was famously a non-conformist, so was actually quite a religious guy until he was in his early 20s, and then turned his back on the church, had a bit of an epiphany and went, religion doesn't do anything for us. However, was always a person who really valued a good sermon. And when wartime happened, and there was quite a big debate around should we be drinking when our guys are serving overseas, and should we be encouraging what was deemed as being fairly immoral behaviour, David Lloyd George decided to lean back into his religious roots, and in fact the Methodist Church became really important in pushing for a temperance movement during the war, which I in a way quite admiring for, because it's like use the tools that you've got, and if it's John Wesley, then let's go with that. So I think you'll have seen these if you've looked through the archive downstairs, because it became quite a moral issue to get people to stop drinking. Now clearly Kitchener didn't want people who were really boozed up on the front line, so I can see that it worked when people were actually in the troops, and there's a really good argument for helping people to stop drinking. But it became quite a moral debate within the UK about whether we should have a wholesale act against drinking, and there were various moves that were made. So on local levels across the UK, there were various counties then that completely prohibited it. And you can see some of the arguments are made in there, which was that one of our biggest foes is drink. So David Lloyd George making it a bit about loyalty to the UK's war efforts. And then this one, which was about don't drink alcohol on Mondays, and really kind of being blatant that it was actively working against the war effort if you were going to drink. There was kind of a health undertone to this, but it was very light touch. It was really much more about moral issues. And I think when it's presented in the archive, it is about people being able to help with the war effort, to be able to sort of manage their home farms and to be able to work and keep the country moving. But it was actually much more moralistic than that. One of the things that I particularly like about it, and Peter, you'll have recognised over the years that we've done a bit of this pledging behaviour, but the pledge card was something that was distributed quite broadly across the UK. So you were able to sign this card to say that you're not going to drink, and then to get someone to witness it, and then you would be able to show this. If somebody said, do you want a drink, and you'd be able to show your card going, don't ask me if I want a drink, I'm not allowed to because I've signed the pledge card. Interestingly, that is still quite a well-used marketing technique. So there's a guy called Caldini, who I'm a big fan of, who's got this theory of persuasion, who talks about commitment as being one of the cornerstones of helping us deliver on our behaviour. So if you put something in writing and then you tell somebody else that you're going to do it, and Mig and I talked a little bit about this just now, you are way more likely to stick to that course of action, because we like to be consistent as people. So not against the pledge card, however, I am against this. So one of the big moral dilemmas of the drinking during the war period is that quite a lot of people, mainly the right-wing press, thought it was despicable that women were drunk on the streets. And they were, because they, for the first time, had money of their own. Their menfolk, whether that was their dad or their husband or their boyfriend or their brother, were overseas. And they were sort of beginning to form a new sisterhood, and part of that sisterhood was getting a bit rat-assed on a Friday, which I think started quite a strong tradition. And I quite like the fact that they were women responding to this by actively going to the pub more. So there's quite a lot of evidence that what happened after this campaign, so this went off for about 6 months, is that the instances of women being drunk and disorderly actually went up by brilliant. So there's going to be quite a lot of elements of this which are about women being overlooked or otherwise subjugated, by the way. The other important George in the first part of this story was King George. Initially I put the wrong George in this, by the way, and I kept looking at it going, he looks really young. And then I realised that it was the wrong King George. So this is the older King George. And he sort of waded in under the heavy influence of David Lloyd George and the Methodist Church, it's fair to say, and deemed that no wine, spirits or beers will be consumed in any of His Majesty's houses after today, Tuesday, the April 6, 1915. So he, because of that, became a bit of a celebrity ambassador for temperance. And in fact, the campaigns that followed this were people talking about, follow the King's lead or don't go against the King. And there's this whole kind of idea of you were being unpatriotic if you had a drink. So the war in health and alcohol kind of was led really by the Georges and inadvertently by John Leslie, and about a typically gendered debate around women being drunk. So marketing techniques. This is a bit that's made up, but I think it's taxed. So if anyone wants to dive in and disagree with this at this point, it's fine. But I felt that there's a bit of reframing in there, so moving it from a pious choice to a moral choice, which was quite an interesting shift, because whilst the Methodist Church was really big at that time in the UK, moving it into a moral choice made it much more accessible and sort of diluted the religion out of it. So I thought that was quite clever. Interestingly, there is a campaign which I absolutely love, which I don't know if any of you have seen, but about 5 years ago there was a diet called the Skinny Bitch Diet. Has anybody seen that? So it's like it's like a really horrible diet. It was like, what's that fatty, wake up and smell the coffee, you don't need it. And loads of young women, especially kind of like teenage women, got really into the diet, but it was actually funded by the Vegetarian Society. And if you read the diet, it's all about, it started being vegetarian and then it's about vegan, but I quite like that under the radar they've slipped in this agenda by reframing it as a different thing. So reframing, celebrity, like literally reeling in the big guns. The King says don't drink, I think is something that if you and I were working on the campaign would have been pretty chuffed with. And then social norming. So there was a big move, a negative social norming effect, which was saying to people, people around you, those that have got a bit more moral fibre who are part of the war effort aren't drinking. So take a long, hard look at yourself. So that's the first one. If anyone wants to leave now, by the way, the rest of them are going to be very similar to this. So if you're not enjoying it, then you can go. So the next one, I was like really torn about whether she was my favourite or not, and I don't think she is, but I think she's still pretty awesome. So this is Gertrude Denman. If you look up on Wikipedia, people call her Trudy, and I tried that and I just felt really comfortable about it, so I'm going to call her Lady Denman. So she's an incredible person because clearly, I think you can tell from the picture, extremely privileged. So very privileged background, actually came from a family which were rich industrialists. Her dad had a number of businesses, but her mother also was quite a radical industrialist of her own time, and actually one of the very first feminists in this country. So her mum, Annie, was one of the pioneers of the women's liberation movement. So already I love this whole family. She ended up, so Gertrude, ended up being married to a peer, so a Liberal peer, Lord Denman, and together they moved over and he became the 5th Governor of Australia, so very important in terms of the formation of Australia as a country. And in fact, I think we can see here on this next slide, naming Canberra, which is quite interesting because they knew the area that was going to be the capital city, but nobody knew what it was going to be called, which I don't think that was how they did that. I thought that you knew what the town was called, and then they'd say that's the capital, but apparently not. So it was a bit like the Oscars. Basically, she was given an envelope and kind of opened it and went, and the name of the capital city is Canberra, which must have been an exciting moment. However, the reason that she's in a presentation about health pioneers is because when she went over there, and she's quite a spirited person and likes to get involved, and in fact, her kind of joineriness is the reason that I like her, because she was involved in everything. Not all good. I'm gonna fess up. But when she went to Australia, there was this real big gaping social inequality in access to healthcare. So they'd already identified that people who lived in rural areas, and especially those people that lived in the bush, had very, very poor access to healthcare. So this is 1913. And there was one nurse that worked rurally in the whole of Australia. By by the time she left, which was only 3 years later, she'd managed to open 14 health centres. So there was about 3,000 people working in that short space of time, because she went, okay, you know, you're busy being Governor of Australia, I'm going to crack on and sort out this health inequality issue, and managed to, just I think by sheer force of will, set up this whole network, which then formed the basis of what is quite a worldwide recognised bush healthcare system in Australia. So pretty cool. However, this is the bit that I felt like I was struggling with this a little bit. When she came back to the UK, it was the war was just about to kick off. And at the time, people thought it was fine to smoke. I mean, not just fine, they thought it was actively quite a good thing. And so part of the war effort was encouraging people to save their cigarettes and to send them to their men serving on the front line. And so they had these big rallies where you could, you know, there was a bit of an amnesty and you could hand your cigarettes in and then they would be sent off. And this one is from the archive downstairs, which you can see. And that was a government-funded thing. So, you know, the government were actively encouraging people to do that because they thought that it was good for the health of serving men overseas, but also really good for their morale. I'm just going to put a little call out to a guy called Thomas Fraser, who was a physician at the time, because as far as I can tell, he's the only person who went, hang on a minute, I'm not sure about this whole smoking thing. And so he wrote a letter to, I think it was to the Times in 1916, which said it's fully recognised by some people in the medical profession that cigarettes are not wholly a good thing. So baby steps, I think, at that time during the war, but he was pretty much on his own with that. And in fact, the efforts behind trying to send cigarettes overseas and in fact smoke them were really consistent. Lady Denman invented this thing, which I absolutely love. Because there's so much about this, which is like, yay, let's all get our cigarettes out. So the poster, which I think is beautiful in its own right, has got loads of things in there. So people enjoying a smoke, you know, they're having a lovely time, even though he's, I think, been really badly injured. And then in the background, a nurse, you know, looking on, I guess encouragingly, that they're having a cigarette. And then these really dangerous looking pins that people were encouraged to wear, I think to just really notify to everybody that you were throwing yourself into Fag Day and having a lovely time of it. But that was organised by Gertrude, who loved it so much that she threw open her beautiful home at Wellcome Hall to sort of get all the cigarettes in, and then to redistribute them and to set it was a big celebration. So by the time, she only worked on this campaign for a year. I mean, enviable work ethic in my view. But by the time she finished, so she stepped down because she got way more commitment after 1916. But they'd actually distributed 265 million cigarettes, which I calculated it based on the number of today's smokers. And we could give everybody who smokes in the UK a pack and a half of fags if Gertrude was around. So I kind of think that if she was here, I think she'd have seen the light and she would be pretty good as somebody who could get people to stop, because I feel like she could do anything. See, not me. The other thing that I like about Fag Day is looking about how far we haven't come. So this is No Smoking Day, which ran for about 30 years. It was a British Heart Fund. I think it was always a British Heart Fund campaign, and then DH funded it for a long time. And then it's scrapped, I think.
It's still around.
Is it still around? So I picked this one because it was particularly interesting in the whole kind of VE Day, you know, victory thing. But there is something about smoking and the idea of having a day that celebrates it, either to stop or to start, which has obviously stuck with us and we've never been able to move forward from. I also really like this because No Smoking Day was a terrifically successful campaign. We've worked on it a little bit, but also it was definitely the precursor to Stoptober, which is the best campaign ever to have run. So I just wanted to nod to what Lady Denman went on to do, because not satisfied with helping everybody kill themselves through smoking, she then went on and did lots of other incredible things. So during the war, she became the chair of the Women's Institute subcommittee on the Agricultural Organisational Society, which was basically the precursor to the Land Army. So it was her and the people that she worked with who galvanised the whole country to dig up the gardens, to home farm, to keep chickens, and to basically fuel the food supplies of the UK during the war, which undoubtedly contributed to our ability to stay relatively healthy during the war years. That then became the Women's Institute. So I didn't realise this, but the Women's Institute kind of fell out of that piece of work. So really sort of tied into something really significant about keeping the country on its feet during its hardest times, which makes me feel a bit differently actually about the Women's Institute. So she chaired that. I love the fact that she basically became the chair of the Women's Institute and then was re-elected annually 32 years. And then eventually she went, I'm going to step down now. And I kind of think that if you were a member of the Women's Institute and you had a vote, there's no way you would have dared vote against Lady Gentleman. So I think she probably stepped down realising that maybe some younger blood would be helpful. And then the last thing that she did, which is the one what we see on the right-hand side, is that she was a really fundamental founding member of the Family Planning Association. So recognised that women had delivered a lot during the war, that their role in society was really fundamental, but that they were being held back by their inability to moderate when they had kids. We're going to talk a bit more about family planning in a second, but she was definitely pioneering that area because as the wife of a peer, that was a hugely unpopular choice to make, and she still did it. So, marketing techniques, I kind of feel like she would hate the word marketing techniques, but I'm just going to throw some at her. So the first one is audience understanding, and I think while she was an extremely privileged woman, so from a very wealthy background, and never fell on hard times, despite the fact that at the time lots of the peers did, she was really intrigued by the working classes, and I think a lot of the work that she did started from how can we help them and how can we involve them. So the Women's Institute, despite its reputation, was actually very, very working class. So the first people that started the movement across the country were those who worked in areas where there was tiny bits of land, so often very poor rural communities, but were able to help themselves. So I think she's pretty cool in that area, and I think as a marketer, empathy and curiosity about your target audience has got to be probably one of the first principles. And then the second thing I liked about her is this kind of whole systems approach. So during her lifetime, she got involved in nursing, nutrition, social justice and family planning. And I think that one of the marvellous ways in which health works is in people, especially in government, recognising that there are multiple factors that affect how people do health-wise. And so you can't just fix the one thing, you can't just fix smoking and expect the rest of poverty and access to health services or access to good nutrition to fix itself. You have to look at everything in the round. And maybe not all at the same time, but certainly over her lifetime, she did that, and I think that's pretty cool. Right, the next person, Mary Stopes. So I kind of went into this thinking that she was kind of bulletproof, and have come out of it feeling a bit uncomfortable about her as a person. Does anybody know that Mary Stopes' background? No. So, I mean, certainly a pioneer and a feminist, and I think we have to give her some marks for that, and then we will take some marks away for her slightly dodgier beliefs in a second. But she published this book in 1918, so Britain's just coming out of the war. People are still very uptight, especially about sexual matters. It was the first book ever to acknowledge that women might have an inkling of sexual pleasure, and at the time that was quite shocking. I mean, maybe it still is. Who knows? But the book talked about birth control within the confines of marriage, obviously, but it also talked about how men and women interacted in their relationship and about the way that we could all strive for more fulfilling sexual relationships with each other, which was really shocking, and it caused her to become quite a celebrity, an issue which she courted. So you can imagine that this was quite controversial. So parts of the church really disliked it, but then other parts of the church quite enjoyed it because at least it was about marriage. So she was very hard-line that it was sex within marriage. She also was quite hard-line anti-abortion, although, as rumour has it, she would publicly be anti-abortion, but then privately, within the confines of her clinic, give people a bit of an order as to where they could go and sort it out. So at the time, you couldn't get an abortion legally, so it was all done on the back streets. It also her work also divided the establishment more broadly, because it was the first time that women were having the conversation about birth control as opposed to men having the conversation. And interestingly, Mary Stopes' own archive, which you can access, I think, somewhere, but there's 10,000 letters, which is incredible. And she sort of courted this role as an agony aunt, but not in that she published the letters. She wrote back to everybody individually, and there's letters of some people that asked her advice on every part of their life. So they'd go, think about getting married, what do you think? And she would give them a bit of advice, generally yes. And then she'd go, I think about having children now, but when do you think it's a good time? And so she would enter into this dialogue with people. Interestingly, I think, is that about 40% of her letters are from men. So having read Married Love, I think they're kind of when my wife thinks there might be something in this. I don't know if there's any more specific guidance. And so some of the letters are quite comical and came from all over the world. So she became quite a celebrity and also a pioneer of women's rights, and especially around sexual liberation. Don't forget, this is some way before the official dawn of sexual liberation in the 60s, and Mary Stopes was absolutely nailing it. She was joined, or her peer group, with this really impressive bunch of women. So from left to right, we've got Lady Constance Lytton, so she was a suffrage campaigner, Maud Royden, who's a women's suffrage, chair of the Women's Suffrage Societies, Vera Britton, who was an author, and then Emily Pethick Lawrence, who was the former treasurer of the Women's Social and Political Union. So really awesome women who sort of bonded together over this issue. However, this was not the sisterhood, and in fact these women were fiercely competitive. And over the course of her lifetime, Mary Stopes had to defend herself against various ones of these as they publicly turned their back on the mission that they'd all embarked on. And there's quite a lot of nuance in the whys and wherefores of family planning and about whether you were open to abortions or whether you were open to sex before marriage. And they all had slightly different views on it. But they formed this kind of alliance against the wider pressures, mainly from the church, that they were facing. So they're quite interesting. And a bit like Lady Denman, Mary Stopes is much more at home with women from lower social classes. So lots of the advice that she gave, especially through her letters, was focused on those women. And then when she opened her first clinic, which is on the left-hand side, if you want to go and see where she's got her blue plaque, this is in Marylebone, by the way, and it's well worth a visit to this house. But where she first opened her clinic was in North London. And that was kind of positioned as a safe space where women could go and talk privately about their experience at home, and especially in the bedroom. And she invited women to come into that. And the focus was very much on inviting women from what we would now refer to as C2G communities, but those that came from impoverished backgrounds. And she would advertise in papers to say, my clinic's open, you can come and see me, there's no charge, it's a free consultation. And so on the surface of it was quite a pioneer and was, all about inclusivity. The kind of dark backstory to this is that she was also heavily involved in the eugenics movement of the time. And so really Mary Stopes' agenda, and this is very much debatable, but if you want to read into it, it is worth it because you kind of come away feeling a bit conflicted. But her agenda kind of verges on the ethnic cleansing. And certainly she was quite a big proponent of working class women having fewer babies. And read into that what you will. People of the time threw rocks at this, as you can imagine. So there's a guy called Dr. Halliday Sutherland who wrote a book, which is also, all of these books are still in print, by the way, it's worth reading. He wrote a book called Birth Control, A Statement of Christian Doctrine Against the Neo-Malthusians. And he actively started a campaign against Mary Stopes because he was very much of the, we should have birth control, but it should be for everybody, and it should be for creating a community where everybody can thrive. And he really wanted everybody to limit themselves to two children. Whereas Mary Stopes is kind of going, could you limit yourself to none if you are from a working class background? He wrote this really fearsome attack on her. I'll read it out, it says, in the midst of a London slum, a woman who is a doctor of German philosophy has opened a birth control clinic where working women are instructed in the method of contraception described by Professor McElroy, so he was another big name in this whole debate, as the most harmful method of which I have had experience. So it's quite interesting because we're just after the war, and the way of phrasing it, so a German woman, was very pointed. And the fact that she was involved in eugenics is obviously quite problematic given the time. And then the kind of slight, which some of you will have missed, around a German philosophy doctor was quite pointed because actually Mary Stopes had no medical training whatsoever. She did have a doctorate, but it was in philosophy. And so if you sort of package all those things up together, along with this quote that I'll leave you with for a second, you kind of get this picture of a woman who, you can't take away the fact that she pioneered birth control, but at the same time, there are people within our shared history who do things through motivations which don't sit comfortably with where we are today. And I think that's quite an interesting conflict to deal with internally. However, I still think that, on balance, the legacy of Mary Stopes is a good thing. And certainly, and I want to say this because the organisation Mary Stopes International is quite separate from her and came into force in about 1976 and is well recognised as being an organisation which very purposely has dedicated itself to giving access to birth control around the world to communities which wouldn't have had them. So I don't want to sort of take anything away from Mary Stopes International because they are amazing. So in terms of marketing techniques, I kind of think public relations, and she actively courted controversy. I mean, unbelievable, some of the work that she did, which she published, which sort of bordered on the outing herself as a eugenics professor in order to generate more publicity for Mary Stopes International. The name of the organisation I've forgotten temporarily, but it was something like the Organisation for Planned Birth Control and Racial Success, and she realised quite quickly that it was better to call it Mary Stopes, and I think we can give her a bit of credit for that because she realised the power of her own brand fairly early on in the development of that organisation. The other thing that I wanted to mention is content, because I think we kind of get quite perved up nowadays about long form content, which is something that's been around for ages. I mean, that's what books are. So she recognised that, and when she published Married Love, it actually had repeat publications where she would actively list in the front of each new edition of it some of the attacks that people had levelled at it, and of course because it was her book she was then able to defend herself against those attacks in a very erudite way, and she was a marvellous writer. So I think her ability to kind of go, right, let's republish that book because that seemed to land pretty well last time, and it gives me a platform that will be literally in people's homes to tell them about what I want to achieve is a good thing. So she was pretty special in lots of ways, and I mean if you're in the least bit interested, I think that the archive still exists, and it's well worth looking at the letters that people wrote to her, because quite a magical piece of social history in terms of the frankness of people about their sexual relationships at that time. So more women. The next two I absolutely adore as well. So can you see on there what their names are? So this is Gert and Daisy. I don't think anybody in the room is old enough to remember Gert and Daisy, but they went on for years, like genuinely about 35, 40 years. So they were the sisters of, can't remember his name now, their brother was Dixon of Dock Green. Can't remember what it's called, somebody Waters. Lawrence, do you know? Huh?
Jack Warner.
No, it was definitely Waters, but maybe it was Jack Waters.
Jack Warner was Dixon.
Was it? Oh, maybe it was involved in it. This is what I said about the facts. I can't be held responsible for them. But anyway, they were the sisters of whoever the guy you just said. Probably. And they were this amazing double act. So genuinely sisters in real life, never married, complete workaholics. Created this pair of characters. So they were quite well to do, but they created Gert and Daisy, who were this homespun pair of working class women who were dealing with the trials and tribulations of everyday life. And Gert's husband Walter appears quite heavily in all of their sketches as this complete layabout who never gets off his arse, and she's always going home to get the dinner on. But they'd created this little sort of comedy duo that were really consistent performers on the BBC. For a long time. So there's a show called Workers' Playtime, and they were a regular segment on it in much the same way as there's comedy on the BBC at the moment. And during the war, they were pressed into active service and were asked to do these little segments. So there were 6-minute segments where, under the guise of being sort of entertaining bits of comedy, they wove in information that the Ministry of Food needed to tell people. So it would be anything from the moral problem with hoarding eggs was quite a big topic. That's appeared so much in this whole thing. That very immoral to hoard your eggs. Or how to make a recipe out of your rations, or the problem with ration cards, or how to access dairy. And they did this whole thing, which is beautiful because they're set up roughly in that you'll get 2 or 3 minutes of them chatting and doing this comedic thing, and then they'll slip a message in, which is, don't forget if you get a leg of mutton, that this is what you should do with it. And I think we can play a little bit in a second, but these are available. There's loads of them, but I think it's quite interesting how even back then we'd recognise the power of influence marketing.
Daisy, have you had the breakfast on the table? Okay, I'm just coming. got to put a shoelace in a knot off. Yeah, I do it for us with the girl. I can't undo it, and I don't want to cut it. Can't walk there with a shoe in the end all day, can I? Yeah, you started cooking early in the morning. What are you making? I'm making a stuffing. Stuffing? What for? Oh, you never told us we were going to have turkey. Hey, John and Santa Claus has come down the chimney already. Oh, no. I was afraid not. I might say Christmas won't be the same this year, what with Bert and Wally away. I know.
I'm going to stop it there, but I think you can tell that they're hilarious. But it is, I mean, they are genuinely really funny to listen to, and I think of the time, it was quite, you know, brilliant content, and people were very familiar with them as characters, so the perfect vehicle to be able to talk about what the Ministry of Food needed you to know. The slide we've skipped forward on, I know it's there as well, is that off the back of that, they produced this cookery book. So again, sort of thinking about the way in which nowadays as marketers, we look at how we can merchandise something which is performing quite well. They had it completely down pat. So you can't get this anymore. You can get it on eBay, but it's an absolute fortune. So I've just pinched these pictures. This is a copyright issue, you see. But this book was quite interesting because it has got loads of wartime recipes in, 122, but it has also got other things in there. So around, you know, how to mend a pair of socks and about how to look after your home. So loads of domestic hints and tips for the wartime homemaker. That was funded by the Ministry of Food. So, you know, government programme which was entertaining and interesting and leaned on these two women who were already national heroes. So much so, in fact, that at the outbreak of war, they were the first act to be flown overseas, and they had special clearance from the Home Office to go and visit the troops, which is quite funny because you imagine that the troops want to see some like saucy girls in suspenders, but they obviously just want to hear about recipes for mutton or be warned about the danger of hoarding eggs, I assume. But they carried on their act, and I've just put this gorgeous picture in there of them when they were quite a lot older, and they still did it. And I guess the beauty of having this double act is that it just ages with you, and they did it for like 35, 36 years, and were the nation's sweethearts. In terms of marketing techniques, influence marketing, I mean, it is literally the case study in how you use a character that already has an audience, you borrow the appeal of them, and then you get them to, in a way which is seamless to their own content, talk about a message which is really important. And I mean, when I sort of listen to those, it's like, wish I'd listened to those about 10 years ago, would have been doing way more interesting things. And obviously on the BBC, which now the BBC will tell you that they don't do any kind of advertiser-funded programming. They do, and we know for a fact that we've managed to sort of wheedle public health campaign messages into things, certainly in the last 10 years. Because it's right for the audience and it's in the good of the nation. So I think that's pretty cool. And then advertiser-funded programming, so, you know, completely true partnership between the client and the broadcaster. And when you listen to them, and I hope you will just listen to a few when you go home, but you can tell that they've not compromised their creative integrity at all. And whilst the messaging is really coherent, they are still Gert and Daisy, and there's not much difference between the stuff they did for the Ministry of Food and the stuff they did genuinely for comedy. So they were pretty awesome. And then the last thing there is merchandising, and as well as the cookery work, there was a whole range of things. You could get a Gert and Daisy apron, which I feel like during the war was a real waste of effort. Why are you making aprons? There's other things to be cracking on with, but people obviously loved them that much that they would use those. And then the songbook, which I couldn't get any images of apart from that front cover, but I would be delighted to hear what songs they sang in relation to the Ministry of Food. Okay, so this one I've got to admit was a bit of a disappointment because this is about the first ad ever to air on British TV, which is really exciting. So 1955, obviously a US brand because it, you know, as usual, the Americans are a little bit punchier about using new formats of communication. And when I started reading about it, I knew that it was Gibbs SR. And then I was kind of noodling around on the internet and found this article which said that the original storyboard had quite recently been auctioned. And the article said, it's even got the name of the marketer who commissioned it. And I was like, amazing. So I went off on quite a massive goose chase is the right answer, isn't it? The right word. Is it? Wild goose chase, yeah, exactly. It's because I'm thinking about mutton. And got in contact. So SR Gibbs was then owned. It became owned by Unilever. You know, first it was owned by Pears, then it was owned by Unilever. And Unilever have a absolutely brilliant archive of all the brands that they've ever invented or owned, and it's up at Port Sunlight, but you can access lots of it online. And then if you can't be bothered doing that, you can email them, and then they email you back, which is great. But I went on this goose chase thinking, this guy, D.W. Gibbs, I'm going to find out everything about him. And in my head, I was kind of going, you know, it's probably his dad's like a pharmacist, and he set up this toothpaste company, and then he was this like really rebellious son who couldn't be bothered with university and ended up having to be a marketer because that was all he was good for, and had this whole narrative in my head. And then it turns out that actually there isn't anybody called D.W. Gibbs. And what actually happened is that David Gibbs, who set up the business, actually bought it from a guy who was indebted in Liverpool for next to nothing. So David Gibbs was quite wily. Then in 1845, gave it to his two sons, so David Askland and William Alfred, so D.W. Gibbs. And so actually there never was a D.W. Gibbs, which is quite disappointing, which is why there's no picture of him in here. Anyway, the reason I kept it in is because it is the first ad to appear on British TV, and I think because of that it deserves a bit of credit, and I'm gonna play you that, I think, off here.
It's tingling fresh. It's fresh as ice. It's Gibbs SR toothpaste, the tingling fresh toothpaste that does your gums good too. The tingle you get when you brush with SR is much more than a nice taste. It's a tingle of health. It tells you something very important, that you're doing your gums good and toughening them to resist infection. And as this chart shows, gum infection is the cause of more tooth losses than decay itself. The tingle in SR comes from sodium resinolate, a substance which both dental research and years of use in dental practice have shown to be good for the gums. So, to keep your teeth white as snow, your gums really healthy, and your breath really fresh, see your dentist regularly and brush with SR, the tingling fresh toothpaste for teeth and gums. Gibbs SR.
So I feel like tingle might have appeared heavily in the client brief. And I suspect that's because of that unlicensed chemical that they were infused with. It was like literally rotting your mouth out from the inside. I don't know how long that ad is, but I wish we could make them that long now, because then we could, like they have done, put everything in it. I mean, why not? I showed that to somebody, and they very generously thought that the graph, let's call it, the science bit, was done on bathroom tiles. I don't see that. I think it's just a really shit graph, and they've done it on graph paper. But I liked it a bit better once they said that. So I think, you know, what amazing pioneers to put an ad on TV. I mean, there's no doubt that would have been very expensive. It was an untested medium in the UK. Who's going to watch it? I mean, and also there's quite a lot of messaging in there, so quite complicated for people to understand. And when you look at the storyboard, I also kind of marvel at how accurate to what the creative agency pitch that ad has become, because that doesn't happen. This is the other bit of it. You can see this is the bit. See, this is where I realised that I was wasting my time, where it says client D.W. Gibbs, which is clearly just the bloody brand rather than somebody that I was going to find out about. This was actually, the storyboard was auctioned for a pitifully small amount of money as well, which I feel really sad about. So it was given to the receptionist of Y&R as a present. So she'd been involved in the early stages of the pitch for this work. And then I guess the creatives just went, you can have this. And so she kept it, and then she only sold it about 6 years ago, but she got 900 quid. Oh. I'm like, I would have had that. It's really tragic. That information, by the way, is on the Sun website, so it's probably nonsense. The other reason that they are in here is because it wasn't just that Gibbs did the first British TV ad. They were also always kind of pioneers of marketing, and I thought it was worth pulling out some of the other things which I don't think are in the archive, but might be in the Unilever one actually, about some of the other things that they did. So on the left-hand side is a game that they created called Ivory Castles. I think you can see what they've done there. And it was a game that kids could play, and obviously it was a coupon collect. But if you went into your local shop with your coupons and or your boxes, and they didn't have any in stock, you could send off the emergency coupon which I really like, this kind of sense of urgency that you had to get your ivory castles game. And I've sort of spent a bit of time with toothpaste manufacturers over the years, and I know that kind of getting children to brush their teeth is still something that is a struggle. So I quite like the fact that they tried to tackle that, and I think certainly last year, not really this year, but tooth decay in children under 5 is one of our biggest health issues in the UK. So anything that any brands have done to try and get kids to brush their teeth is pretty good. They were the brand that encouraged brushing your teeth twice. So before then, it was, once a day, if that, quite often for lots of people. But genuinely working with the British Dental Association, they discovered that you were far less likely to have cavities if you brushed your teeth twice. And the BDA acknowledged that they didn't really have a voice, they had no relationship with consumers, and they had no money to talk about it. And so they worked with Gibbs to launch this idea of brushing twice a day. So pretty amazing in that respect. And then finally, on the right-hand side there is this refillable dentifrice tin that you could have. So you could get a tablet to refill your metal box so that you weren't wasting boxes. And given that Unilever are now one of the sort of most pioneering businesses in terms of recyclable packaging, I think that's a really amazing thing to have in their archive, that even way back, they were already starting to think about things that were impacting our world and our sustainability agenda, and making strides to sort that out. So I think they deserve to be in there because they've always been pretty pioneering, and I like the cut of their jib. So marketing techniques, social norming. So as I've said about where is that on the bottom? So social norming, as I said, they were the first people to talk about twice a day. Interestingly, they also campaigned, although this isn't in an archive anywhere, it's just a part of what Unilever sent back to me, is that during the 1950s, the amount of sugar that people ate doubled, because, obviously the war had ended and our access to sugar, and also Britain became one of the biggest sugar refining countries in the world. And so it became a real problem. So tooth decay became the hot topic. And behind the scenes, Gibbs and the people that were employed by them, presumably not any of the DWs or the Davies involved in it, were quite active campaigners behind the scenes working with the government to try and sort out the issue of people having too much sugar. So that's pretty amazing. Clearly broadcast, use an unproven platform. In the ad itself, I like the fact that they just use everything. It's like the demo, some science, the professional endorsement, a woman who can brush her teeth whilst not smudging her lipstick. And I literally like a rabid dog when I brush my teeth, so I'm going to try and sort of ape that a bit more. But I quite like that all of the things that are in that toothpaste ad are very similar to the things that are in toothpaste ads nowadays, and certainly appear in lots of the briefs that we get as an agency who works in oral hygiene. And then the last point there is about sales promotion, and they recognise that having something with their brand name on in the house permanently, especially if that's a children's game and it's something that people interacted with daily, was quite a useful thing to have. So, pretty impressive marketeers. Right, so this one is my favourite. He looks a bit like a murderer, but this is the only picture that I can find of him. So this is Dr. David Player. He's the very tall guy at the back. And this sinister group of people are the original writers of the Black Report, which is actually one of the most interesting documents in our whole history of health in the UK. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. But the reason that I like him is because he was like the first maverick of public health marketing. So until then, the Health Education Council had been run really by civil servants who were quite manipulatable by government, and kind of stayed in their box and didn't do anything too radical. And then Dr. David Player came in 1982, and this is an absolutely brilliant article, by the way. I was talking to Peter about this earlier on, because if you read it, you can kind of change the date to 2019, and nothing has changed. So the bit in there that I like most is undoubtedly it must sell health and allow it to shift its emphasis from threatening people with the horrors that await them if they continue to smoke and drink to convincing them of the benefits of full health. That is literally the debate that we have all the time, isn't it? And we talk in health marketing about harm versus hope, and I think that's kind of ricocheted different sides across the decades. But David Player was very much welcomed by the BMJ, because they recognised that finally we were going to get somebody in a position of extreme power, who would not stand for being manipulated by the civil servants, and certainly that was the case. So he initially was the leader of the Scottish Health Education Group, and they were really pioneering. So they sponsored the Scottish national team, which is huge. I mean, even today it would be amazing for PHE to sponsor England. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, unbelievable amounts of cash. But even just like from a brand perspective, that's quite a ballsy move. And so I like him for that. And then during his auspices, the public health marketing radically changed. So it went from being sort of quite circumspect and educational and about sort of trying to encourage people to make good choices into this, which is by today's standards you would not say quite a lot of it. It became very confronting, and I look at some of these and I'm uncomfortable by the amount of blame they put on people in their target audience. And as somebody who's worked in health marketing for 12, 13 years or so, I think we've got into this routine of kind of treating the consumer like you probably don't realise the harm you're doing. And if you did, of course you wouldn't do it because you're sensible. Whereas David Player's technique was just to go, oi, you're messing things up, you need to change. And I applaud him for that because it turned health marketing into a real skill and a science. In a way that it hadn't been before, and all of these are in the archive downstairs and are brilliant. One of the things that I think it's worth picking up on though is that this was the era of body shaming, and during that whole time it was absolutely fine to suggest to people that you would never have sex unless you lost some weight. And I've picked out the female one, but there was a male one as well, which is on the previous slide. And it makes me realise how far we've come in terms of being intolerant to people suggesting that there is an ideal way, an ideal body shape, or the suggestion that we won't be an attractive sexual partner unless we look a specific way. And I'm quite proud of the fact that we are now in a space where if we saw that kind of imagery, we would react to it in a different way. And I don't take objection to the fact that David Player was encouraging people to lose weight, because I think there was a good health argument for that. I do really object to the fact that he was suggesting that you did it primarily for aesthetic reasons and that you would be judged and marginalised if you didn't do it. And then I think we're now in a world where we just don't accept that anymore. And this is just some of the many, many responses to Beachbody Ready, which are hilarious actually. I've not looked at these online before. But we are very quick to go, no, we're not going to stand for that anymore. So it's interesting that, whatever that is, 30 years ago, the government were funding body shaming. I mean, as a headline, I think you can't really argue with that. And now we would be wholly horrified if that were the case. So it makes you realise how far we've come in some areas. This next bit of video, I'm a bit nervous about because Peter and I edited it just minutes before we presented, so it could go really wrong. Also, as much as I love David Player, he's got quite a sonorous voice, so I'm not going to play loads of it. But one of the things that I wanted to show you is that when he took the role at the Health Education Council, he was quite Machiavellian. And so one of the things that Peter and colleagues at PHE have developed as a real kind of profession is partnership marketing. So that balance between working with industry, but at the same time being able to tackle industry on what they're doing in terms of health. So, for the good and the bad. So being able to hold them up as being responsible for people's health, whilst at the same time encouraging them to make changes. And actually, Dr. David Player recognised that. And because in Scotland, they'd had a really close relationship with the alcohol industry, because of the well-documented problems that the Scots have had with alcohol abuse over the years, he brought that attitude to the UK. One of his big agendas was salt reduction, which is still going, and he was really focused on the fact that commercially sold bread had ridiculous levels of salt in it at the time, and there were two organisations, so there was Rank McDougall and Allied, big bakers, and they were fiercely competitive with each other. And he went into these negotiations, not like we were talking before actually about pharmaceutical manufacturers, where they kind of played along with each other, and we're all friends and we're going to sort out the salt thing, it's a nightmare, isn't it? And it kind of went on, and then it came to a bit of a halt. And I'll play this video. I'm going to play it just a tiny bit of it because it's going to get boring. I wonder how we play it.
We decided at the end of the day was that I got together with Allied and we put our logo, the HEC logo, on Allied wrappers.
The Hillstone.
Yeah, Hillstone. Saying, bread is good for you, special wheat bread. We put them on the Allied wrappers. We agreed to do this. Now, bread production has been run down in this country ever since the war. And I predicted that since health is a marketable product, it would reverse and start going That's in fact what's happened. So Allied agreed to do that, and I predicted that Ryan would come back to the negotiating table within a month. In fact, they were back within 3 days, but they were really furious. They were furious. We decided.
So, I love everything about that video, by the way. Like, why are they sat so close together? It's like, I don't know. It's like the guy who's eating, if you don't know, is almost on David Player's lap, which makes an interesting dynamic. But the thing is that he's very understated about the fact that that was quite a major thing to do. You know, at the time, we was just under Thatcher's government, I think at the time. You know, industry was paramount, and anything that kind of made a threat to the productivity of industry was deemed to be pretty irresponsible. So there's David Player suddenly going, I'm going to play off your commercial motivations against each other in order to get you to do something that I want you to do. And in fact, it worked. So the reduction in salt, if you look at the data, in bread products took a massive nosedive because suddenly he developed this health stamp that they talk about, which was massively marketable, and because mums especially wanting to do the right thing for their kids, it was quite an easy default to go, well, let's get the healthy one. Peter and I have worked a lot on this topic about you know, whether Change for Life is a stamp that you can give to brands and products, and it's a very political and contentious topic, and I think I'd not realised till this that had already happened so many years ago. So David Player, quite an interesting character, and he had a riveting career briefly whilst he was in charge of the Health Education Council. He came unstuck in quite a massive way, and there's various blogs online, one by a wonderful woman called Margaret Reed, who in that picture that I showed you at the start was the primary researcher for a report which was to be their collective undoing. So the Black Report had been released in 1980, and as I said, it is one of the most significant pieces of literature in the archive. It talks about the radical inequalities that we have in this country between health, so you know, access to healthcare, but also the way that impoverished communities live with significantly worse diets, and importantly, the way in which successive governments had enabled that to happen. So the fact that the North East of England was suffering hugely under a Thatcher government was directly reported in this. It was searing in its criticism of the government. So clearly David Player didn't take office and go, better walk that down because it's uncomfortable truth. He immediately commissioned an update to the data, which was worse. And under Norman Fowler, who we're going to come on and talk about in a second, who was Health Minister at the time, had this back and forth with this report, which was called Inequalities in Health. And it's awful, and you can buy it now as a joint publication, but you can tell that if you were a Conservative government of the time, there is nothing in that report that you would want published, because it just sticks the knife in to the fact that on a policy level, and activated by the civil service and by their lack of funding around the country, the Conservative government had actively promoted a health divide. So it's really unflinching in its criticism, which for somebody who worked for the government, I kind of feel must have been on purpose, because he's not going to have been unaware of the impact that would have on his job. And on the day of, I'm just going to tell you who these guys are first, actually, because they're really important. So this is Lord Black himself, and then this on the other side is Arthur Buller. This picture was taken at a reunion in 1998 of all the people involved in the Black Report, which are the pictures of it are online. And I like to think that there are all these scoundrels who were involved in the sort of taking down of the government who kind of got together just to laugh about it, because the agenda for the conference that these pictures are taken at is absolute nonsense, and it basically covers like health policy since the Black Report, and then I think the afternoon session was health policy since inequalities in health, and I just think that all their presentations were probably made by going, do you remember that time when we really stuck the knife into the Conservative government? But I particularly like Lord Black, who looks like a complete wrong 'un on this side. But anyway, the Inequalities in Health was published in 1987, but it was published under a set of circumstances that would have been very in place in the thick of it. I don't know if people watch that. But on the launch of this report, so they've been backwards and forwards, and I had the privilege of being briefly seconded to PHE during a time when we were doing this, where it was like, there's going to be a report, when is it? Oh, it's going to be out next week. Okay, well, what's going to be in it? Well, we've had to delete loads of things because the minister's changed. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? And it was like, it was unbelievable because you kind of like, the degree to which you have no influence on what's going to be in a report which is published under your auspices is incredible. And that's what happened to these guys. So inequalities in health was watered down, bits were taken out, and it was made to be a much lighter weight document which was less critical of the government. So because David Player is amazing, he just decided to publish the version that he liked and arrange this press conference within Whitehall. And then as people were arriving for the press conference, so journalists, and he was very well connected in the media, somebody in his team leaked that they were publishing the original report as opposed to the revised and official report. They guests turning up for the press launch were literally shepherded to a different building where a smaller launch was held with no copies of the document available. So they moved it around so that it was never really released under its original with its original content in it, and the press launch was just a bit of a joke. The next day, David Player woke up and the Health Education Council had been canned. So they literally, Norman Fowler, if we've had enough of you, so because we can't just get shot of you because you're a total nuisance, we're going to disband the Health Education Council. And so they did it the next day. In its place was set up the Health Education Authority, which then in turn became the communications arm of the Department of Health, which then in turn became Public Health England. So strong legacy of troublemakers within that organisation. But I salute David Player in all his gloriousness for the way that he changed the way that marketing worked, really, in terms of health, but then also just would not go down without a fight. And in fact, his legacy is amazing. And if you look at the work that he's done since then, primarily in Scotland, around health inequalities, it really is sort of setting the benchmark for how we should tackle inequalities across the country. And a lot of his publications are still available and well worth the read. So he is my absolute favourite within this whole talk. In terms of marketing techniques, I think partnership marketing, so I think he was the first person to actively engage in industry and to make them do stuff, you know, with a bit of carrot and stick. He was also, I think, one of the pioneers of liberal paternalism, which gets a bad rap, but I still think it's actually quite a useful way to market. So this idea that you can, in some instances, work from the assumption that people make poor choices, because I think some people do, and I think actually it's fine to steer them and nudge them and give them information which helps them make better choices. And I know that we could debate until we're blue in the face about the definition of better choices or poor choices, and I have. But in my book, anything which sort of expedites somebody's journey to death or otherwise compromises our ability to treat the health of the nation is a poor choice. And it's fair enough to use all the techniques we can to help stop that happening. The last one is PR and spin, and he was absolutely master of his own brand. So he courted controversy, no doubt, in more so the way than Mary Stopes did, I think, and would sort of leak things constantly to the media, which is really frowned upon, but as we all know, is the way that politics and the media work together. And I think because of David Player working in that role within the Health Education Council, it kind of paved the way to go, we can have people who are brave and pioneering and somewhat maverick work and be in charge of our health and make a good impact in that. And if Sheila were here, rather than, you know, celebrating her CBE, I would say Sheila was one of them, and I think we're very lucky to have people like that in our health marketing nowadays. I feel like this has gone really fast, or have I talked really fast? Okay, fine. There's only one left, so you might be thankful for that. So Norman Fowler, despite being a bit naughty in terms of David Player, I still thought he was due a bit of credit in the presentation, because I do think he's actually pretty awesome. So on the left-hand side, you've got Norman Fowler, who was the health minister during the 80s. And on the right-hand side, you've got a very lovely man called Kevin Thomas. So he's somebody who I met as a result of doing this talk, who is delightful in lots of ways. So one of the things that you'll have seen downstairs is the 1986 AIDS Awareness Archive, which is incredible. There's actually lots more to see online. If you Google it a bit, there's so much more to that campaign, which I think is worth looking at. But I tried to find somebody who'd worked on it, and I met Kevin. who's now a director and actually has kind of a bit of a side hustle, which is about this AR dementia experience, which is absolutely phenomenal. So the thing that he's most proud of, apart from this, is that he makes these are AR experiences which help take people with dementia back to the first one they did was the coronation. They've now done the World Cup, so it helps them relive things that they'll remember from when they were younger, which I think is incredible, and they do that free of charge. So just a little note to say that Kevin's brilliant. But I met him to sort of say, you were part of the AIDS awareness commercial, like, you know, what do you think about that nowadays? And he's such an unassuming guy that he said, oh, you know, it's a campaign, isn't it? And it was really good, but I don't know why you want to talk to me about it. And I'd found this bit of data that said that despite, frustratingly, instances of HIV in the UK are gradually on the increase. We still have a very, very small epidemic. About 110,000 people live with HIV in the UK. Compared to most Western countries, that's extremely small per capita. But this piece of data says that the reason that our epidemic is lower and grows slower can be directly traced back to the fact that we responded to the AIDS epidemic so quickly and with such a very clear point of view. So for those of that you remember it or have studied it since, you'll know that there was this awful phrase which was the gay plague. And in the United States and in France actually, that was how the AIDS epidemic was treated. So it was about marginalised communities. It only happens to gay men or prostitutes or people who inject drugs. The rest of us should be, if anything, a bit disgusted that that's happened. And there's certainly no need to worry if you're a good, sort of wholesome, heterosexual person. You know, don't get worried about it. And we didn't do that at all. And I spoke to Kevin, and it was really interesting because he said that the clients at the time, so Norman Fowler was a client, which obviously is quite unusual because normally that's not a ministerial job, but it was so important and so terrifying. And also nobody really knew that much about it. So when they were briefed in 1986, we'd only had one instance of AIDS in the UK, which started in 1981, and it grew over those 4 years, but it was still very small, but people didn't know anything about it. So when they did that campaign and they said, you know, you can't catch it off the toilet seat, you can't catch it if you drink from the same glass, people were still a little bit medically unsure of that. So it was a really volatile situation to be working in. But I think we should be really proud of the way that we responded because Norman Fowler and the team that worked with him, and I don't unfortunately have the name of the marketers that worked on it, if we make this about marginalised communities, then we ostracise them and we do far more for their role in society, far less for their role in society than we do for the issue of AIDS. And so as a country we've made the active decision, and I'll play you a couple of ads actually, we made the active decision to be really clear that anybody could get it. And that resulted in some quite terrifying material, and there's a person that I work quite closely with, who my colleagues will know who I'm talking about, who blamed these campaigns for him getting no sex in the 80s. I think it was because of lack of charisma, but I'm happy for him that he believes that it's because of these ads. But let me just play you, I think there's two.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman. So far it's been confined to small groups, but it's spreading. So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
Pretty terrifying ad. But you'll see that within there, it immediately sets up, it immediately sets up that it could happen to anyone, and it says man or woman. So we had this huge campaign, and there's quite a lot of out of home as well, which is, you know, it's got the tombstone in it, but I think the ad is particularly powerful. And it was a real point, so all of the PR that went around this, there's quite a lot of leaflets, it all made a real point about it being something that we all had to deal with. And I think that is something quite special actually as a country to have done it, because it would have been so much easier to kind of point the finger and to be blamey and to isolate people, to get them to deal with it on their own, and obviously we didn't do that. So Kevin, one of the things I like about him, because at the time, 1986, Kevin's a junior creative. Despite images, he is not 200 years old, by the way. He was quite junior at the time. And I said, why did you work on it? Did you like actively petition for it? And he said, we moved jobs for it actually. So the campaign had been awarded to TBWA, or the account had been awarded to TBWA, and they were working at A&V at the time, so Abbott Mead Vickers, if people don't know advertising agencies. And at A&V, I think we can establish a pretty good agency. And Kevin said that I can't remember what he said now about the client, but he said they'd just made this campaign, which everybody loved. And so they had a bit of bargaining power at A&V. And because they felt really passionately that you would be able to make great creative work, and it was a topic which was going to be really important societally, he and his creative partner phoned up the creative director at TBWA and said, can we come and work on the AIDS campaign? And obviously this creative director was like, who are you? And they were able to name check this bit of work that they'd done, and they went for an interview with their book, and the guy at TBWA really liked it, and the creative directors made the Tombstone film. But he said, we just were in this place at the time where we really want to do that work. And if he says no, then it's fine, because there's no way A&V going to sack us, because we've just done this really great campaign anyway. So he kind of went to it, and he said it's interesting because it's quite a turning point in his life, that they started working on something which was so important and then became really quite notable in later years, and was the thing that made them interested in health marketing. And he and his creative partner, who are now both directors, have as a result of that AIDS campaign, always done a pro bono health project since then. So for the last 30 years have been doing one thing a year, which is about giving back to the health community. So evidence, I think, that health kind of gathers round it, people who are very sort of socially minded. But I'll play you Kevin's ad as well, because I like it. And I also like this unsettling moments reference at the start.
There is now a deadly virus which anyone can catch from sex with an infected person. But you can't always tell if someone is infected. And unless we're all a lot more careful, the people who've died so far will be just the tip of the iceberg. So protect yourself. It's safer if you use a condom. And remember, the more sexual partners, the greater the risk.
Terrifying. So Kevin said that was it quite a difficult relationship with the client? You know, was there a degree of you wanted to make it more scary, they wanted to tone it down, or was it quite even? And he said no, it wasn't. Everybody knew that we had to, we had to go for shock and awe. And the only moment during the whole creative process, which was a bit fraught, was that the creative team thought you should use the word Johnny rather than condom. It was like, nobody knows what a condom is, you should definitely say Johnny. And we've had this conversation quite recently, because we pitched, sadly unsuccessfully, on the cervical screening programme, and we had the exact same debate. We were like, it's a smear test, and the client's like, it's cervical screening. Your friends, these are. And we're like, I think women know it is a smear. It's like, and you can get stuck into this like common parlance, but anyway, clients won, and I don't think it undermines the ad in any way. And Kevin says at the time he felt like it was the most significant thing to sort out, and looking back on it, it doesn't really matter at all. The other thing I wanted to say about that campaign, oh gosh, it's going to play again. In fact, I'm going to go here first. Is that the TV ads are the bits that people know, but that, when I was speaking to Kevin, is not what he is most proud of, because the TV had to be mass, because it needed to sort of land this message that it wasn't the gay plague, and that we had to get everybody to change their behaviour. But the work that they did as creatives was to tackle. They never did anything which was specifically for a gay audience, but they did do lots and lots of stuff which was for a drug-using audience. And Kevin said, we're fairly middle-class lads, and we didn't know anybody who took drugs, especially intravenously. And so they did quite a lot of work where they went to Liverpool, Manchester, and to London. And they spent 2 weeks hanging out in squats, in drug dens, in needle exchanges, speaking to dealers, speaking to people who took drugs. And he said it was a really eye-opening experience, because they'd kind of started off creating, so this campaign's quite niche audience. They started off creating activity which spoke to them in a sort of too much of a health and official kind of authoritarian way. And off the back of spending time with the audience, they produced this. This is the only one that he still had, which he sent me, which is it only takes one prick to give you AIDS. which was trying to kind of remind people that it wasn't just about sex, even though that was the message we'd been told. As a drug user, you were actually far more likely to contract it. He is really proud of the fact that they got really under the skin of the target audience and spent time getting to know them. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that it says photography Don McCullum. That's actually not true. Don McCullum apparently took every other still image in this campaign, and he doesn't do that much commercial work, so that's pretty impressive. But he did every other image apart from this one. And Kevin said, I just wish I could find you some of Don's actual pictures, but he's not got any of them in his book or his archive, so I can't find any, but if you do, then they're worth looking at, because that must have been pretty impressive to work with Don on such an amazing campaign. I'm going to go back a slide, because I think it's worth calling out these two people, and this is like, you know, the baddie and the goodie in this whole story. I think lots of us will have heard of James Anderton, so Chief Constable of Manchester Police, predecessor to John Stalker, I think, who was obviously knifed in the back and then left under a cloud. I think James Anderton is the most odious person I've ever encountered, and I'd kind of heard of him anyway, but only in connection with the Moss Side riots, and he did a fairly good job of quelling that social unrest in Manchester, which I'm personally thankful to him for. However, he was a man who was driven by his own religious fervour in a way which makes John Wesley look like he was a bit slack in terms of church going, and his religious beliefs infected everything that he did, and never was that more horrible than with his active campaign against the AIDS campaign. So he took it upon himself, and he had a fairly big platform because of the Moss Side riots, to actively petition Norman Fowler and the government against the work they were putting in, so against the money that they were spending on this, about the way that they were talking about it, on the fact that they weren't blaming people. And he used this phrase, which I'm sure some of you will know, which was his comment on the people that were suffering from AIDS, were basically gays, drug addicts and prostitutes who were swirling in a human cesspit of their own making. And he said that publicly about people who were suffering from a life-ending disease. And I find it incredulous that we would have somebody in such a position of power who was so actively abhorrent in every possible way. However, he doesn't matter, because nobody remembers him, but everybody remembers Terence Higgins. And in fact, the building that we're in today, I believe, was the original home of the Terence Higgins Trust. So Terence Higgins, sadly, was the first person in this country to die of AIDS, and was an active campaigner for gay rights, but also for a more tolerant and loving environment in which to treat people with HIV and AIDS, and therefore became the name of probably one of the best charities in the UK, and one that is still very, very actively involved in researching and supporting men and women who live with AIDS in the UK and overseas. And I thought he was quite a nice person to end on. And I'm glad that when you Google search both of these people, you get way more on Terence Higgins than you do on James Anderton. So in terms of marketing techniques, the first one is broadcast and narrowcast, and I think that the AIDS campaign is a really terrific example of how you can target everybody. So a message that we all need to know because we need to change behaviour, but we all need to know it as well because we need to provide an environment in which those that need to make change feel comfortable to make change. And then the narrowcast bit, which was about targeting the audiences who were most likely to be affected and to understand them and to communicate in a way which was going to help them make the changes that they needed to make. The middle one there is grassroots activation, because alongside of this, obviously came a huge upsurge in the number of community groups that were set up around quite often the gay community, but also the drug-taking community. So groups that had been really marginalised and felt that they had no voice, suddenly finding that they could come together and be supportive and actively say, we need your help here. We don't want to be forgotten because this is a disease that can kill us all, and we need your help in that. So I think the grassroots activation around it was absolutely beautiful. And then the final one is PR and stakeholder management, and that's why Norman Fowler, despite being mean to David Player, is in there, because I think nobody in terms of health secretaries, certainly in my research, has done such an amazing job on behalf of such an incredible topic. And if we had a bit of Norman Fowler in Department of Health, I think we might be making some more progress. That's all. Those are all the people I wanted to talk about, and I kind of left the last word to Kevin, because when I said to him, my topic's called this, marketing doesn't save lives, marketeers can. Do you think they can? And he went, you have to believe you can. That what you say or create can make a difference, and that's a pretty amazing thing, isn't it? And I think he's right.